So, pero hindi natin alam bakit siya may trangkaso. Or may history siya, may trangkaso, tapos may history ng travel, let's say sa NCR. Tapos, or may trangkaso siya, tapos dun siya nakatira sa area na may local transmission for the past 14 days prior na nagkaroon siya ng simptomas. So, yun yung um, um, one definition also of suspect COVID-19. And then, individuals with fever, cough, and shortness of breath can also be suspect COVID-19 for as long as under sila sa mga categories na to, 60 years old above, may comorbidity, ibig sabihin may comorbidity, may high blood, diabetes, sakit sa bosyo, yung sa thyroid, and then yung iba, yung mga health workers, and high-risk pregnancy. Okay. Next is probable COVID-19. So, how do we define COVID-19 case na probable? It is a suspect case who fulfills any one of the following listed. So, sino yung may test results for COVID-19 that are inconclusive or nag-test ng positive sa COVID-19 but the test was not conducted in a national laboratory na officially accredited by the DOH, or yung mga probable na COVID-19 case are those who fulfill any halimbawa namatay either sa bahay or sa hospital without undergoing um, any confirmatory testing. So sila yung mga probable case. Okay, so that ends our definition of terms. Ngayon, let's go to the zoning containment strategy framework. So basically, in the succeeding slides, we will discuss pertinent details of this strategy, particularly the zones, parameters, and geographical units. But for the purposes of this slide, the zoning containment strategy is applied in order to identify focused areas for implementation of varying levels of quarantine, depending on the risk and stage of transmission prevalent in the area by the local task force. As shown are the areas classified into 4 zones. So meron tayong critical zone, yun yung red. Yung orange po, yun yung containment zone. Ang yellow, buffer zone. The green one is the outside buffer zone. In implementing these zones, we need to keep in mind and utilize several principles. It is the principle of mass concentration, in which we concentrate our efforts at the most advantageous areas and places and time to achieve the decisive results. And second is principle of economy of force, in which all our available resources of the LGU are utilized in the most effective way and concentrating the resources in one area where it is greatly needed. So this strategy was also used by the WHO's framework way back in 2007, in 2003 during the SARS and outbreak and the pandemic influenza. So this general concept of zoning containment was also used. Okay, so what is the purpose of this strategy? Basically, the zoning containment strategy, when it is implemented, it is necessary that the PDITR interventions can be conducted. Kaya tayo magla-lockdown po, mag-identify ng areas, ano lang yung i-contain natin para hindi blanket, hindi malawakan yung pag-contain, kailangan natin ma-localize makita kung saan lang ang may clustering of cases. And when we lock down this containment strategy, it is important that we use the PDITR, yung prevent, detect, isolate, treat, and reintegrate strategy or interventions that can be conducted in an efficient and timely manner in certain areas while ensuring that possible positive individuals are not mobile. So, nako-contain po natin sila. And therefore, the zoning containment strategy will allow the local task force to conduct first contact tracing. Second, once na-trace mo na yung mga close contacts, you isolate the positive and then quarantine the close contacts. You treat those with symptoms and then you test. So, you do na yung testing. So, these are the activities that will be done while zoning containment strategy is being implemented. For example, um, one once a cohort of clusters of cases in a particular purok was identified by the local task force, it can immediately implement a lockdown to the said purok once na-reach na niya yung parameter. So by the lockdown area, the local task force is able to ensure that all possible infected individuals is contained and is not infecting others. The local task force is therefore able to conduct contact tracing immediately, conduct yung resource natin, hindi siya time consuming pag nagkanda ka agad. And since nearly all possible close contacts are already contained, and conducting the succeeding activities such as testing, isolation, and treatment is easier to implement when we do this. So what we need now is fast recognition of the possible confirmed cases. Then immediately implement the zoning containment strategy so that the implementation of PDITR can also commence immediately. So this one, to apply the zoning containment strategy, it is imperative to know the definition of the four zoning classification. So how do we categorize an area as a zone? So we define an area, dito po sa slide natin, each zone, sa critical zone, containment zone, buffer zone, area outside buffer zone, an area must meet the said parameter for each zone. And the parameters of each zone are the following. So pag critical zone, this refers to the areas where initial number of cases or several clustering of cases have been identified within the past 7 days. Yung containment zone naman are those areas without new cases but are adjacent to the geographic unit categorized as critical zone. The buffer zone, on the other hand, refers to the areas without new cases but are adjacent to the areas categorized as containment zone. And all remaining areas without new cases, yun po yung outside the buffer zone. So, ang bottom line dito, ang concentration natin is identifying really ano yung geographical unit na we categorize as critical zone. So subsequently, how do we apply these zones in varying areas? For example, so doon na tayo babalik sa mga current realities natin on the ground. So in the guidelines, we identify and call these areas as geographical unit. Each geographical unit has specified epidemiological parameters for it to be categorized as critical zone. So in the succeeding slides, we will show you each geographical unit and their respective parameters for us to be familiarized with. Okay, let's start with the first geographical unit, the house. So we define the house as a geographical unit defined as single unit in a residential building or enclosed physical structure over a plot of land. A house can also be a condo unit, a townhouse unit, apartment unit, dorm unit, or room unit. It can also be a prison or a jail cell, among others. And for a house to be categorized as critical zone, at least one case of either suspect, probable, or confirmed COVID-19 has to be present. So, how do we visualize this? Okay, ganito po yun. So, this is the geospatial representation depicting a house as a critical zone following the parameters previously discussed. So, next slide is the residential building. The residential building is defined as condominium, tenement, dormitory, multi-door apartment, places of detention such as correctional jails or formation places such as church, dormitory, or convents or monasteries. For a residential building um, with floors, a residential building floor shall be categorized as critical zone if two cases of either suspect, probable, or confirmed COVID-19 are present in two different units within the same floor. And for a residential building that will be categorized as critical zone, ibig sabihin pag critical zone, yun yung ilalockdown. At least two cases of either a suspect, probable, or confirmed COVID-19 are present in two different floors. Ibig sabihin sa isang condominium, for example, pag may dalawang kaso na po or marami pa in one floor, so that's residential floor lockdown. Pero pag may two cases, at least two cases identified in two different floors, then residential building lockdown na po ang gagawin. So, ito po yung sample of a residential building classified as critical zone or lockdown area wherein two cases are identified. So, yun yung ila-lockdown lang. Yung building, hindi po yung lahat ng street. Okay. So, moving on is business, work, or school. Okay, any establishments where goods are made, stored, processed, or where services are rendered, we define it as business, school, or work establishment. So, yung parameter on that is small business establishment with less than 1,000 resident occupants is categorized as critical zone if there's one cluster of cases. So, ibig sabihin po, yung isang cluster of cases, ibig sabihin nun may dalawang cases yon, two cases or more. So, if we have one cluster, dalawang cases po, where the individuals identified have been physically reporting to that establishment for the past 14 days. So, yun lang po yung ilalockdown natin. So, this is the, okay, this one is for the big business establishment with 1,000 or more resident occupants. We categorize a big business establishment as critical zone if they have two clusters of cases composed of either suspect, probable, or confirmed. And then each cluster of cases is reported from separate buildings or separate floors or separate wings of that particular establishment. And whichever is applicable, yung individuals po na yon are identified that's been physically reporting to that establishment for the past 14 days. So this is how it looks like for an establishment to be categorized as critical zone or lockdown area. Next is market. So we define market as an area where commercial dealings are conducted, and it can be a mall, supermarket, dry market, may mga hardware or furnish shop market, and then wet market, palengke, yung mga talipapa. So for a market to be categorized as critical zone, at least 3 clusters of cases composed of either suspect, probable, or confirmed were identified in the barangay kung saan po yung market ay nandoon. This provision has special attention being given to the marketplace where transmission dynamics is high due to population movement and density, which will increase contact rate of susceptible population para magkaroon ng sakit or mas spread yung COVID-19. Okay, now let's go to the street. So we define street as a single path or road or a route between two places where houses, buildings, or establishments are found. And also, a national highway shall not be considered as a street based on this guideline. So for a street to be categorized as critical zone or a lockdown area, it has to have at least 2 clusters of cases composed of either a suspect, probable, or confirmed case of COVID-19 identified in different houses or different buildings or establishment along a specified street. So next slide will show you a geographic representation of a street categorized as critical zone or lockdown area. Okay, next is block. So for a block, we define block as a parcel of land bounded by the sides, on the sides by the streets. So if we classify a block to be critical zone or to be a lockdown area, ang parameter po natin doon, at least meron siyang 3 clusters of cases. So if we define cluster of case na 2 kaso, ibig sabihin nun, pag may 3 clusters ka, so 2 times 3, 6. Ibig sabihin, minimum, pag may 6 na cases sa isang block, that's being identified as COVID-19 confirmed, probable, or suspect in at least 2 different streets surrounding a block, we will impose a block lockdown. So ang ibig sabihin niyan, in a geographical representation, ito po yun. So ito yung block. So kung nakikita niyo po, 4 po na streets yan. So may main street, tapos meron pang 2 street sa loob, may parang loop. So it has 2, 3, 4, 5 streets surrounding that block. And if there are, yung sabi natin, at least 3 cases, clustering of cases. So pag may 3 clusters of cases in that particular block, block lockdown po ang ating gagawin. Okay. This one naman po is a geographical representation of a lockdown area or critical zone of a block plus a house. Pwede po kasi yon. Pag yung house na yung katabi, yung nasa gilid, ay may isang kaso, tapos yung isang block, meron din silang clustering, 4 na clusters of cases ito. So you can do a block lockdown and a house lockdown. At least hindi buong barangay na lockdown. Kasi hindi niya na satisfy yung parameters. Okay, so next, purok. Yung sa purok naman po, we define purok as a division within a barangay using usually composed of 20 to 50 households po yan. And for a purok to be categorized or classified as a lockdown area or critical zone, at least 3 clusters of cases is identified in different houses within that purok. So, yan. So let's go to subdivision or village. We define village or subdivision as a group of residential plots or houses, compound, gated community, or village. So for a village or subdivision to be classified as critical zone, it has at least 4 clusters of cases composed of suspect, probable, and confirmed COVID-19. These cases will be identified in at least 2 different streets or blocks within the subdivision or village. So ito po yung geospatial representation that portrays a subdivision or a village as a critical zone following the parameters previously discussed. So, barangay. Yung barangay, we have 3 subcomponents. We define a barangay as small territorial and administrative unit forming the most local level of the government. So, meron tayong barangay na densely populated, meron din tayong barangay na sparsely populated, and also a settlement area. So we separate that also in our consideration for the lockdown. And then for the parameter, if a particular barangay, for densely populated barangay, pag meron lang silang 5 clustering of cases present in 3 different sitio or 3 different purok or block, then that particular barangay is identified or categorized as critical zone or a lockdown area. And for sparsely populated barangay, it can be categorized as critical zone if at least 2 clusters of cases composed of either suspect, probable, or confirmed have been identified in 2 different sitios, puroks, or block. Sa settlement area naman po, yung settlement area, pag may nakategorize natin siya as critical zone or lockdown area, kailangan may dalawa siyang clustering of cases present in at least two different streets in that or area in that particular settlement. Okay, so this one will show you the geospatial representation lang po ng barangay on a critical zone or lockdown area. As you can see, marami na pong clustering of cases, kaya hindi na kaya yung block lockdown lang or street lockdown lang or establishment lockdown lang or house lockdown. So, buong barangay na. So, let's go to municipality. Yung sa municipality naman po, yung parameter natin is that if 25% of the barangays in a particular municipality were declared as critical zone, either may causal link to areas reserved and occupied for residential or commercial corridors, that particular municipality will be put into lockdown or magiging critical zone na siya basta 25% na kanyang barangay ay na-declare as critical zone. As well as sa city naman po. So yung city, yung parameter din natin, if 25% of the barangays were declared as critical zone. So this is what a municipality critical zone or lockdown looks like. And now we have discussed how specific geographic units can be classified into zones. Now, what interventions naman po can be implemented in these identified zones? So in the succeeding slides, we will discuss what interventions are needed to be implemented in the following zones, yung critical zone, containment, buffer, and outside buffer zone. The framework that we will use is the rolling stages of intervention. Ang ibig sabihin lang po ng rolling stages of intervention is that it's a set of community quarantine interventions in the zoning containment strategy, which will allow and authorize the local authorities to implement a localized COVID-19 response. The rolling stages of intervention is a framework in which a type of community quarantine is designated for each zone. So for example, for critical zone, ang community quarantine intervention is ECQ. And then, ang ano po nito, if one type of community quarantine is designated for each zone, in which upon every reassessment, a geographical unit may oscillate from one zone to the other, depending on the epidemic situation and circumstance, whereby stages of interventions in each type of community quarantine is implemented towards the observance of the new normal. So the activities or interventions in each type of community quarantine shall be in accordance with the omnibus guidelines of the implementation for the community quarantine. This is published by the Interagency Task Force, and the types of community quarantine shall correspond to the following zoning classification. So, yung critical zone that will be placed under ECQ, yun yung lockdown. And then yung containment zone will be placed under modified ECQ. And then yung buffer zone will be placed under GCQ. And then yung outside buffer zone, yun yung modified GCQ. Until such time na halimbawa yung isang barangay, August, marami siyang kaso, na-meet niya yung parameters, so na-lockdown siya, classified siya as critical zone. Ang community intervention noon ay yung mga ECQ guidelines. So yun yung ano sa kanya, mag-a-apply the ECQ guidelines. Yung identified na mga areas on that barangay, so yung katabi niyang barangay, yun yung ma-identify as modified ECQ kung containment zone yun. And then, yung mga barangays na nasa buffer zone, yun yung naka-GCQ, yung outside buffer zone, yun yung mga modified GCQ. Okay? So, okay, this one, there are questions arising, like, for example, what if may nagtanong what if my province was placed under ECQ? Can I declare areas without cases as MGCQ? So, to avoid confusion on how to implement the rolling stages of interventions in the zoning containment strategy and declaration of community quarantine measures by the IATF, the diagram shown will serve as our guide. So if the zoning classification shall determine the interventions to be imposed and implemented by the LGU on subject geographical units, but in no case shall interventions be lower than what is prescribed by the policy for each zoning classification, taking into consideration also the existing level of community quarantine imposed on the area by the IATF. So for example, you noticed na sa halimbawa, municipality or sa city ninyo, you notice that a barangay has 7 clusters of cases, pero scattered siya in various areas of the barangay. Thereafter, you categorized the barangay as a critical zone and placed it under lockdown or ECQ. And then you remember that your province was placed by the IATF under modified ECQ. So therefore, you decided to place all the succeeding zones, yung containment zone, buffer zone, outside buffer zone, under MECQ. Kasi ito po yung lowest possible community quarantine measure that you can impose within your province. Okay? So, I think this is the last slide, yung recommendation for community quarantine policy in each zone. And and operationalizing this will give the next part of the discussion to Robin for us to understand how to operationalize the zoning containment. So that's the part only na nag-define tayo, tapos nabigyan ko po kayo ng parameters para sa susunod na discussion, yun na po yung operationalization. So from here, I will give the virtual mic to Robin for the second part.
Yes, thank you very much, Dr. Queenie. So I think there's a question right towards the
Yeah.
chat box, but I believe this would be discussed by Sir Robin, and it will be answered later on.
All
So
right.
for the next part of our orientation, will be presented by Sir Robin Lim of the Central Office Disaster Information and Coordinating Center or the CODIX. Sila po yung nagmo-monitor at nag-implement po ng operation listo natin. And siya rin po yung, ano yun, Robin, ikaw ba yung father of management of the dead and the missing?
Yeah.
Well, anyways, please welcome Robin Lim of the
All right.
DLP Central Office.
Thank you, Ralph. Before we proceed, no, with the second part, no, it's really important to consider our health. So I'm proposing for a 3 minutes na health break po. Health break tayo ng 3 minutes para makapag-CR tayo at makapag-stretching. So I'll see you back again at 3:05. Thank you.
Okay, so we'll take a break for 3 minutes. And while maybe the others are not going to use the John, you could post your questions in our chat box para makulate po natin and we'll answer them during our open forum.
Ralph, can you see my screen? Am I loud and clear? All right. Everyone here? Okay. Regards po kay Madam Mary Ann Riba. Kumusta ka na? I miss Car, I miss Baguio City. Anyway, let's keep things light, no, to each and everyone, to all listening. Now we're done discussing the zoning containment strategy. No, diniscuss na po natin yun, the purpose, the concept on why we are doing this. Na-discuss na rin po natin yung mga parameters, no, kung paano ba magla-lockdown ang isang area. Ngayon, we will be discussing now on the importance, I mean, now that we learned all the terminologies and the concepts, it's time to operationalize it, no? How do we implement the zoning containment strategy? So, but before proceeding, no, let me emphasize this lang po, no? As COVID-19 continues to ravage our country, the National Action Plan or the NAP for COVID-19 is now focusing its effort in ensuring that the response is more localized and at any COVID actions are directed to the smallest unit of the society. And of course, the main actor for the implementation po ng ating zoning containment strategy is the local task force, which is being headed by the local chief executive. So, the National Task Force po, no, has conceptualized this strategy as a way for the local task force to implement actions that are responsive and calibrated at their own localities. And I really encourage everyone po listening here to internalize and to really understand this concept wholeheartedly, because if we are going to really implement this the proper way, mababalance po natin yung economic impact po and of course the health ng ating locality. So, this will be the outline of the presentation. Mabilisan lang naman po, only three parts. Number one is the organization and operationalization. Then next, the specific activities of each zones, monitoring and reporting. Now, moving on, no, as shown on the screen are the steps, no? Ito po yung mga steps na kailangan po gawin ng ating local task force para po makapag-implement sila ng zoning containment strategy at isa-isahin po natin ito. Now, just a quick run through lang po, no? You might have implemented and enforced some of the steps mentioned here, no? Iba po sa inyo dito at alam ko po, several LGUs in the car has already implemented several of the steps here presented. And iba po sa inyo dito ay nag-go beyond, no? And exceeded what is being asked from from this policy. It's really okay, no? You may ito po mga steps dito are not inclusive, no? Hindi po ito cast in stone. You can expand and collapse it as deemed necessary based on your locality po. Depende po sa LGU nyo. So to start things off, let's start with the number one, no? Where do we start? Of course, we start by organizing our local task force. And 100% of you in CAR has already organized your local task force against COVID-19. So sa mga gusto po na just a refresher po, this structure here presented on the screen is based on the DILG Memorandum Circular number 2020-77, which the local chief executive heads the local task force. And of course, um, meron po siyang apat na teams, no? Number one is the contact tracing team. Next is the diagnostic testing team. Next po, meron tayong patient management and monitoring team. At meron po itong tatlong sub-unit. And meron rin po tayong logistics and resource support team. And of course, other teams may be organized as deemed necessary. Now, you would be wondering, what if yung LGU ko ay nag-organize na ng incident management team, no? Or you have already implemented the incident command system. So wala pong problema doon. all we need to do is just to integrate these functions here doon sa ating IMP, no? Para magampanan po natin ang mga trabaho. May purpose po itong structure because later on we will be discussing the 8 major activities. So that this is the first part, no, organization. After we have organized our team, it's time to conduct, no, to conduct community-based syndromic surveillance and early recognition of patients with COVID-19. Now, how do we do this, no? When we say we do active surveillance, hindi lang po ito contact tracing. There are many ways for us in doing active surveillance po, and contact tracing is just one of them. So again po, no, aside from identifying cases, no, when we say conduct of active surveillance, ito na po yung paghahanap natin ng mga active cases. At ito rin po yung paghahanap natin ng mga suspect probable. Ito na po yung pagkakandak natin ng house-to-house monitoring na ginagawa po ng ating mga barangay health workers and BHERT teams. So aside from identifying cases through contact tracing, there are several ways in identifying cases through surveillance. So, ito po no, isa-isahin po natin. Number one is we utilize our knowledge in the clinical presentation of COVID-19. So remember, diniscuss po ni Dr. Queenie kanina kung ano po yung ibig sabihin ng COVID-19. Ano po ba yung mga simptomas niya? So it's really important for the team, for the local task force to understand kung ano po yung mga simptomas na to. Kasi ito po yung hahanapin. So after nyo pong malaman, no, kung ano yung clinical presentation ng isang COVID-19, we screen the community and look for individuals who are presenting with the signs and symptoms of COVID-19. The health workers po, the BHERTs or the barangay health workers, or even the telemedicine platform can help us in doing this. No? And then this should be actively done regularly. Next din is we can closely monitor any clustering, no? Clustering of ILI and SARI cases. Kasi po, the ILI and SARI cases doesn't totally mean that they are immediately caused by COVID-19. No, hindi naman po lahat ng nagkakasakit or may nagkaroon ng influenza-like illness ay COVID-19 na. However, by monitoring these cohorts, we can early recognize possible COVID-19 clustering of cases in the community. So, 'di ba? If we target that
Hindi ko
area po,
alam.
if we target that area po in an eventuality na magkaroon po ng positive case doon, ay hindi po tayo mahihirapan later on. Now, um, our city, municipal, or provincial health officers are trained in identifying these patterns. We can also connect with the hospitals and look for possible clustering of these cases in a certain area based on their admission. Next po, we can also establish sentinel sites. No, how do we do this? So we identify a specific small number of health facilities that are responsible for collecting data on cases enrolled with the case definition under surveillance, which is COVID-19. And of course, pwede rin po natin gawin to everyday po, no? So next dito po, after we have organized and at naghanap na po tayo ng mga kaso, no, nagkandak po tayo ng active case surveillance at nag-contact tracing tayo, ang next na kailangan natin gawin is to get a detailed and current map of the area. Example po, no, for a barangay. So if wala po kayong available na system, no, we can always revert back to the what is presented on the screen, yung mga spot mapping natin sa barangay. However, kung meron po kayong GIS, no, yung ArcGIS na mapping system, you could always use that and plot your cases. So, and then of course po, ito pong spot mapping, si barangay po ito gumagawa. Pero si local task force po, si municipal or city, municipality must consolidate the map para magkaroon po siya ng bigger picture ng kanyang entire municipality. Now, let us do a quick test, no? I need your answers po. Based on this picture po na nakikita nyo, ilan po yung clusters of cases meron? So may I request everyone to pin in your answers po dito sa ating chat box. Ilan po yung clusters of cases na na-identify po natin dito sa mapa? Wala pong may gustong sumagot? Pwede pong i-chat yung sagot. Alright, may sumasagot po? More po. I need more answers. Alright, so we have 4 clusters of cases po presented on the screen. So thank you very much po sa mga sumagot at si Ralph na pong bahala sa inyo, sa inyong mga premyo mamaya. So, as flash on the screen, meron po tayong 4 na clusters of cases. No, yan po yung naka-red na dot, no, yung 1cc, 1cc, 1cc. So mamaya po babalikan po natin 'yan. So after we have organized our team, after we have searched the cases in our barangay or in our LGU, and we have actually spot mapped everything, ang next na kailangan pong gawin natin is to categorize and declare each geographical unit into zones and type of community quarantine. So after doing a spot map of COVID-19 cases of either a suspect, probable, or confirmed, categorize zones with cases as critical zones. Afterwards, i-delineate po natin yung area into a uh, containment zone, buffer zone, and outside buffer zone. So it means po, pag meron po tayong isang bahay na nagkaroon ng isang cluster of cases or isang case po, i-lockdown po natin yung area. So yun po yung assessment, no? And then we categorize the smallest possible geographical unit into a critical zone. And then po, pag ma-cluster, pag malagay po natin siya into a critical zone, yung corresponding area nyo po, yung area niya po outside, i-categorize natin into a containment buffer and outside buffer zone. However, if an overlapping of zones classification occurs, no, the zoning classification with the stricter measures shall take precedence. So, isang example po dito, pag meron pong isang area under um, pag meron pong isang condominium na building, tapos sa kasamang palad po, nasa gitna po siya ng isang critical at saka containment zone. So ang susundin na action po ng isang building na yun ay critical zone po. No? The same applies if that building is in between the containment and buffer zone. Buffer zone parameters shall apply to that building. And of course, the local task force, no, with the concurrence of the regional IATF, shall then be authorized to declare the geographical unit within his or her area of jurisdiction. Now, before we proceed, no, ang next step, no, na kailangan gawin natin, no, after we have categorized and declared each zone into a critical zone and na define na po natin kung anong community quarantine yung kailangan niyang gawin, 'di ba po? If you are under a critical zone, the community quarantine ay enhanced community quarantine. And if you are under a containment zone, it is the modified enhanced community quarantine, and the same follows for the buffer and outside buffer zone. Now, ito po, no? In doing so, no, the local task force together with the regional IATF must ensure that community quarantine measures are implemented to the smallest possible geographical unit. Why do we need to do this? Because while we mitigate the spread of COVID-19 in our communities, we would also like to ensure that economic and vital social activities are not restricted. A balance of both health and economy must be our ultimate goal. So ito po yung purpose ng zoning containment strategy. As much as possible po, we would try to lock down an area to the smallest possible geographical unit, no? Kung maaari po, kung hanggang bahay lang, edi bahay lang po. Kung isang apartment na building, hanggang apartment building lang po. Or kung pwedeng isang business establishment or isang block or isang street, no? Or isang subdivision. So marami po tayong options, no? Kaya po tayo may options para before pa tayo makarating sa barangay lockdown ay ano po tayo, no, we are all assured that before we declare the entire barangay into a lockdown, kailangan po mag-qualify po siya sa parameters na sinet ni National Task Force. So ayun po. So example po, no, let's go back to our drawing. Now, using the spot map on the screen, no, let's practice. So, the barangay has reported 4 clusters, di ba? And this was distributed in various places. So, given this, no, how many critical zones are they now? No, ilan ngayon yung critical zones sa area at ano-ano ito? Can I have your answers po? Can you chat your answers? Okay. Ilan critical zones po? Okay, more answers po. Alright. Tama po yung ibang sagot nito, no? Base sa ating mapa, we only have 2 present, no? Isang block under critical zone at isang bahay under critical zone. So, this is the beauty of the zoning containment strategy. Instead of you having 4 clusters of cases in an area, yung 3 cluster of cases, pwede kasi siyang i-confine sa isang block lang. Kasi because those 3 clusters of cases have qualified to the parameters ng isang block to be put under a critical zone. So kung tutuusin po, no, example po, etong Barangay Julio Uwano, let's say that this barangay is a highly dense uh, uh, barangay with greater than 1,000 per square kilometer population density. So based doon sa parameters natin, kailangan niya ng at least 5 clusters of cases for it to be put on lockdown. So if hindi natin po in-apply yung zoning containment strategy, automatic po may 4 clusters of cases na siya. But with the zoning containment strategy po, na-limit po natin, no, na naagapan po natin yung pag-lockdown ng buong barangay. Kasi po, yung 3 kaso dito ay na-cluster po natin siya in one. So, yun po yung kagandahan dito, no? Para hindi po natin ma-lockdown yung buong barangay. And there were several questions rin po posted in this chat box. So, ito po yung sagot dito. When we are, no, paano po natin ma-delineate ang isang area into a containment zone? So, based doon sa boundary ng critical zone, 5 meters po radius, yun po yung magiging containment zone, and 5 meters po from the buffer zone, yun rin po yung magiging buffer zone natin and outside buffer zones po. So as flash on the screen, no? So you might be wondering bakit 500 meters? So there were several pilot testing pong ginawa on this. So na pag-alaman po namin if we are going to lower it down into like 50 meters lang po, no? So hindi natin ma-properly contain ng maayos ang isang area. Kumbaga yung catchment area po ng disease kasi we're trying to contain the virus, no? Pag 50 meters lang kasi um, parang masyadong ano 'to, maliit. Kasi hindi po natin kasi nga po yung COVID hindi natin nakikita, eh. So, mas maigi po na 500 meters 'no. Actually, the original position of this was 1 kilometer. Pero hindi po siya feasible in areas na maliliit po, so ginawa pong 500 meters, ayun. So, next naman po 'no, and this 'no, on the other hand 'no, puroks, barangays, municipalities, and cities, zonal border method will be used 'no. The same geographical unit used to categorize a critical zone shall be the basis in determining the containment and buffer zone. So, ibig sabihin po, 'pag meron pong isang barangay na na-put on lockdown, automatic po siya ay critical zone. So yun contiguous na barangay niya po, automatic rin po magiging containment zone and buffer zone and areas outside buffer zone. Now next in line, no, upon identification of the geographical unit as a critical zone or in lockdown, the local task force must convene with the regional IATF immediately and announce the decision within 24 hours. And of course, massive information drive shall be done to ensure that all citizens affected by the lockdown will be informed. So again po no, within 24 hours, kailangan po ng concurrence ng regional IATF yung pag-lockdown. So just a quick snapshot, no, ito po yung ating reporting and monitoring flow on the imposition and concurrence of the regional community quarantine. So for the HUCs po, no, decision to impose lockdown on a certain geographical unit or barangay, si regional IATF po yung magko-concur. The same applies for the city and municipalities. Now for the province naman po, no, kung gusto niyang i-lockdown yung buong munisipyo na hindi po HUC or ICC, si Provincial Task Force po yung mag-endorse kay RIATF and siya rin po magko-concur. However, if we want to put on lockdown no, yung entire HUC or ICC or yung buong probinsya po, si National IATF na po ang magko-concur noon. And of course, to properly address issues of misinterpretation, usurpation of authority, unjust political interventions, discrimination, amongst others, a grievance oversight body shall ensure a due process of hearing and deliberation for meritorious complaints and or appeals of individuals or groups in case of unintended, malicious interpretations, and discriminating practices experienced in the implementation of the localized rapid response operations. So kung may mga reklamo po, may grievance oversight mechanism po tayo. And what is more important here is the reassessment, no? So there were several questions posted earlier in this session, no? Kailan ba Kailan ba tayo magde-declare ng lockdown, 'no? Kailangan ba Do we need to wait for the concurrence of the regional IATF for the LGUs to impose the lockdown? The answer is no. Immediately after 'no, if nag-qualify po sa parameters ang isang area na ma-put on lockdown, immediately po, the local chief executive can impose that lockdown in that geographical unit. And kailangan lang po ng concurrence within 24 hours si regional IATF para ma-check niya rin po kung tama po ba yung mga parameters na ginamit ni local task force sa pag-declare ng area into a lockdown. So ganun lang po. Kung tama naman po yung parameters na ginamit, then iko-concur po yan ng regional IATF. If meron po nakita si regional IATF na hindi po nag-qualify, maybe we can further scale down the lockdown into the smallest geographical unit. So ganun lang po yung mechanism natin. And of course, Importante po yung regular reassessment and recategorization must be done in every 15th and 30th or 31st and announced on the 1st and 16th day of the month. Para po sabay po tayo sa ating sa IATF na announcement. And of course, duration of the lockdown in a critical zone must not be lower than 15 days. Mamaya po, meron po akong ipapakitang proseso kung bakit not lower than 15 days. And of course, in order to properly assess and categorize geographical units into zones, the local task forces shall ensure that information, but not limited to the following, are to be gathered beforehand. So, for a fact, no, lahat po ng LGUs natin ay meron na pong ganitong klaseng data. Kung wala pa po kayong data ganito, then you can start gathering it po. And of course, other information and or data analysis as deemed necessary. And you know what? In implementing this localized lockdown, very important po talaga yung risk communication and community engagement. Because we all know for a fact that the government cannot implement this alone. It really needs active community participation. We must make the community understand kung bakit tayo nagla-lockdown. We need to communicate it with them properly para maintindihan po nila yung purpose, the reason behind it, and what are the objectives.
Oh my
No?
gosh,
So,
ang signal ko.
it's okay, ma'am. May signal po. So, it means po, no, um, um, uh, it's really important for us to really communicate this to the local communities, no? Kasi,
Tinurin na parameter na barangay na 3 cases. Tumakas dyan. Barangay,
hello, hello, Ralph?
Hello, yeah, I'm trying to mute the the participant.
Oo. Sige lang. Thank you. Now, risk communication is really vital because we really need the active participation of the community. So, in order for us to communicate this properly with our citizens, no, as flash on the screen, ito po yung mga samples natin, no, mga risk communication strategies, no. We could always follow the outbreak communication guidelines, the use of communication and behavioral impact approach, no, or we must ensure that communication mechanism uh, meron po tayong iba-ibang channels na ginagamit. And next po, ito po, no, additional strategies po, no, ensure that the communities are actively engaged, empowered, and mobilized to implement any type of community quarantine and form partnerships. Actually po, these are just suggestions, no, for you to undertake, because I know and I've experienced it personally that every community, iba-iba po yung approach natin in communicating with them on how it's going to be. So, we leave that to the leadership of the local chief executive kung papaano niya i-communicate ito, kung papaano niya ipaintindi sa kanyang constituents yun importance po when putting a certain area into a lockdown. So, let me just share with you, no, just a few examples. May isang LGU in Aurora, nag-impose sila ng street lockdown, and lo and behold, no, um, wala talaga. Discipline sila, walang lumalabas sa area. So, it was really a um, may active community participation no, pinaintindi talaga nila ng maayos sa areas na yun. It was announced in the radio, nag house to house po ang ating BHERTS, no, our punong barangay na barangay tanods, no, to really explain the process kung bakit. So ayun, maganda po ang kanyang experience. And another po, no, sa mga may mga subdivisions na area, no, in-empower po yung homeowners association So in-empower po yung homeowners association to really help the punong barangay in communicating this to the community. So of course, no, when we do our reassessment and recategorization, may chances kasi po na pwede natin ma-lift ang isang area out of the critical zone or lockdown areas. Ideally, the duration of the enhanced community quarantine in a critical zone shall not be lower than 15 days. However, no, lifting of a community quarantine imposed upon the geographical unit, pwede naman po siya i-lift earlier. As long as magawa po natin tong mga criterias, no? When all surveillance, testing, and quarantine isolations, intervention activities are finished. And the following but not limited to these scenarios are achieved. Number one dito, yung pag-test ng lahat ng close contacts and their succeeding generations are negative. Bakit to importante? Example po, meron po kayong isang confirmed case sa isang barangay. Sa isang confirmed case, nag-generate po siya ng 20 na close contact. Doon sa 20 na close contact, yung 15 doon, negative ang results. However, yung 5, meron po siyang, yung 5 positive po. And yung 5 na yun, yung close contacts niya, let's say meron pong 40 na generate na close contacts doon sa 5. Eh, doon sa 40 po, meron pong 3 na nag-confirm. So it means po no, ang ibig sabihin doon, ongoing pa po yung community transmission. So pag ongoing pa po yung community transmissions natin, ay hindi pa po natin siya pwedeng i-lift. And of course, no new suspect, probable, or confirmed case are identified. And of course, the completion of the mandatory 14-day quarantine measures of individuals in a geographical unit. So again, no, explain ko to. Another example. I explain ko kung bakit 15 days, no? Bakit po ba nilagay ni National Task Force na ang isang area should not be, when we declare an area into a critical zone, should not be lower than 15 days. So, if the local chief executives or the local task force shall declare the entire barangay under a critical zone, or let's go down smaller, the entire block, no, the entire block under a critical zone. Importante po na ilagay niya doon sa kanyang executive order or any policy na yung lockdown po kailangan 15 days, no? Kailangan po 15 days talaga. So ito po yung reasons kung bakit. Number 1, bakit po 15 days? Because meron pong nangyaring meron po kaming case before, no? Ang isang LGU, dineclare niya ang isang area ng lockdown ng 4 days lamang. On the first day, nag-conduct siya ng contact tracing. Hindi natapos. Second day, kasi nga konti yung contact tracers niya. On the second day, ongoing yung contact tracing and ongoing na rin po yung isolation. And ongoing na rin po yung testing. Again, hindi po natapos. Kasi nga, konti yung isolation facilities niya at konti rin yung testing capacity niya. Pagdating ng third day, lumabas yung analytics ng contact tracing, no? Nalaman ng grupo ng contact tracing team na marami pa palang close contacts na na-identify ito. Marami pa pala talaga. So, ano nangyari? That LGU requested for another extension of the quarantine. No, in-extend niya ulit. So, to avoid those kinds of hassles po, it is much better for the local task force to declare an area into a lockdown or critical zone for 15 days for him or her to make the necessary actions po. No? Another example here is we must consider the capacity of the local government unit. Because whether we like it or not all LGUs are the same. Hindi po sila pare-parehas ng capacity when dealing with COVID-19. So, it means po no, if we are going to implement the lockdown for 15 days, meron kasi pong 8 major activities na kailangan gawin. And one of which are presented po, yung pag-conduct ng contact tracing, testing, no? Let's face it, no, hindi po natin to kaya gawin in one day unless we have the right resources at hand. Hindi rin natin to magawa in 3 to 5 days, no? If we're going to check on our capability as well when doing all of the 8 major activities po. So, mas mainam na po na 15 days ang ilagay natin. But you could always lift it earlier. No, you could always lift it earlier as long as confident po kayo na wala na pong local transmission na nangyayari. That all cases were properly isolated, all were traced, all were tested, and all were accounted. So ganun po. Yun po yung reason dito. So now that we're done with the process, no? Yung process ng pag-lockdown ng isang community or ng isang area. And sorry po, no? Balikan ko lang po, no? Again, I almost forgot. So going back to my example, kanina sinabi ko po na we are now um, putting the entire block into lockdown. So based doon sa ating reassessment, no? Nalaman po natin na na-control na natin ang isang area. Yung isang buong block na control na natin. May provision po dito that completion of 14 days quarantine measures of individuals in a geographical unit must be done. It means po, we can now lift the lockdown in that specific block. However, yun may mga kaso po, we could always put on lockdown na lang po yung specific na bahay na yun. That specific geographical unit which is the house or a residential building. No? So yun na lang. Instead of the entire block, we have reassessed and recategorized the lockdown. We left the entire block but we maintain the lockdown on that specific house na lang po until matapos niya po yung 14 days na quarantine measures. Now, we're done with discussing no on how the process of the lockdown will work, kung paano siya i-implement, and of course the lifting. We will now proceed on the 8 major activities. Sinabi po na kanina ni Dr. Queenie that if an area will be placed under a critical zone or in lockdown or in a containment zone, buffer zone, and identified as outside buffer zone, on top of the community quarantine guidelines as set by the Omnibus Guidelines from the IATF, meron po tayong 8 major activities na kailangan pong gawin on top of that. And these 8 major activities, ito na po yung PDITR strategy natin, which is to prevent, detect, isolate, treat, and reintegrate. So isa-isahin po natin ito. Number 1. So as flash on the screen, no, meron po tayong mga measures. May makikita po kayong division no ng critical zone, containment buffer, and outside buffer zone at yung specific na activity at may kaakibat po siyang mga provisions na kailangan gawin. So all of the activities are actually elaborated in the National Task Force Memorandum Circular. So kinuha lang po namin yung mga highlights dito. So first activity here is the perimeter control, no? Perimeter control is one of the most important intervention in the zoning containment strategy. Establishing perimeter control to a specific area only, focusing on the smallest possible geographical unit, will allow economic activities and movement of individuals in areas without COVID cases. And at the same time, we can immediately contain the areas with confirmed COVID-19 cases to limit its spread. So this is really one way to really stop the spread, no? yun mag-lockdown tayo para di na po kakalat yung virus. So, kada kada zones po may kaakibat na perimeter control po, no? Example po dito, extremely restrictive movement and perimeter control under the critical zone. So, to give you a visual on this, ito naman po sa right side ng ating screen, yun may bilog po, no? Nakita po natin yung critical, containment buffer, and outside buffer zone. And in between the lines, no, in between the zones, meron po tayong nilagay na parang dotted lines, no? Yun borders niya. So kung napansin niyo po, meron po yung definition, no? Yun boundary between the critical zone and containment zone. We do not allow entry to or exit from the critical zone. We only allow entry for medical services only and established checkpoints. Next naman po yun in between the containment and buffer zone. Of course, we define the parameter and we limit the entry to the containment zone to essential services and work only. And of course, we establish screening points and points of screening points at points of entries. And of course, in between the buffer zone and outside buffer zone, we allow movement po. So for more details po, kindly read up the national policy on this. No, there are specific guidelines po to really explain the perimeter. But more importantly, these are the Gs. So ito po yung itsura, no, that you are actually doing already. Ito po yung mga perimeter controls natin. We do checkpoints, doon sa airport. Ito, this is sa barko to eh. Pagbaba ng mga LSIs, no, or returning overseas Filipinos, may measures po tayong ginagawa. To visualize this into a map, no, if you're going to plot it down, ito po yung itsura niya. If we're going to plot it down sa ating spot map, so we could always do this, no? And I know that the PNP knows how to do this kasi sila po yung expert dito sa pag-enforce ng traffic controls and regulations. And of course, with a partnership with the local government unit. Now, that is for the perimeter control. Let's now go to the next activity, which is surveillance activities, no? Surveillance and contact tracing activities are vital activities needed to be conducted while the quarantine or lockdown measures are imposed, especially in critical zone. Sinabi po natin dito that sa loob ng critical zone or lockdown, kailangan po magkaroon tayo ng case finding, case investigation, contact tracing, and syndromic surveillance within 24 hours. Sabi ka po ni Mayor Benji, ang best practice niya po is ma-isolate niya po lahat yan within 1 to 3 hours. No? So, if we are fast in doing our contact tracing and isolation, no, and case finding, mas madali po natin ma-stop ang transmission. Now, for the containment buffer and outside buffer zone, we do active case and passive case finding po. Kasi paminsan, yung close contact ng isang confirm na nasa loob ng critical zone, ang close contacts niya, posible nakatira sa containment buffer and outside buffer zones. So just a quick reminder lang, no, these are the 3 basic steps in contact tracing. We have number 1, case identification. Number 2, contact listing, profiling. Number 3, contact follow-up. Next naman po, ito po, mandatory quarantine and isolation and treatment. So, as soon as the close contacts are treated, mandatory quarantine and isolation measures must be imposed within 24 hours. So, kailangan po natin gawin ito para control po talaga natin yung spread ng COVID-19 at more importantly, baka lang naman if all parameters are satisfied, then maybe this would form part of the decision of the LCE to lift the area under the lockdown po. Kasi po, yun naman po importante eh. Ma-contain talaga yung movement ng tao, ma-contact trace sila, ma-isolate yung dapat ma-isolate, and then we do the testing, no? We do the testing, no, ng lahat ng possible na pwedeng mag-test, no? via RT-PCR within 24 hours. And isa rin ito sa mga reasons kung bakit 15 days po kung bakit 15 days po nilagay natin. Because paminsan kasi yung results ng RT-PCR will take us 2 to 3 days pa po before lumabas. Ang iba naman po 1 week pa. So it's really better to impose that lockdown for not lower than 15 days. And of course, we do disinfection activities, no? All areas visited will be disinfected within 24 to 48 hours. Ito po yung mga possible na areas na napuntahan ng isang confirmed case, disinfect po natin. Tapos kung meron pong na areas na nabisita ng isang confirmed case sa isang supermarket or wherever it is na business establishment, pwede po siya, no, pag nasa containment buffer and outside buffer zone po yung area na yun, it can be temporarily be closed for the conduct of disinfection and shall reopen and resume services upon completion of the disinfection. However, pag nasa loob ng critical zone, base sa omnibus guidelines, close po lahat. Except for essential services po. And more importantly, no, physical distancing. No, since COVID-19 is still ongoing, physical distancing measures at an individual level must be implemented at all times. Kasi po, ito po, no, if we, example now that car is under MGCQ, so we must really practice the physical distancing and of course, the practice of the minimum health standards. Because by doing this, we are really stopping the spread of COVID-19. No, yung minimum health standards natin, always washing hands, wearing of mask, no, and so and so. So next naman po, no, an equally important intervention in the provisions of socio-economic support to individuals under lockdown or ECQ or the enhanced community quarantine in the critical zone. So kailangan po natin mag-provide ng assistance rin. Kasi we cannot deny the fact, no, once we put an area into a lockdown, we limit the movement of the individuals. In turn, we also limit their ability to make a living. Kaya importante rin po na magbigay po tayo ng assistance sa kanila. And of course, the local task force must ensure that the provisions of assistance is given in a calibrated and focused manner.
And to capture actual issues and concerns.
So, lastly po, no, this is the last intervention. For LGUs na wala pa pong case or konti pa lang po yung kaso natin, in other words po, manageable pa po, no? It is really important for the local task force to ensure that areas do not have any cases or konti pa lang shall strengthen their surveillance and local health system capacity, guaranteeing that if an emergence, no, ito na po yung sinasabi natin, we must always be ready, preparedness. Pag wala pa po kayong COVID-19 case, the better. So, dito po tayo mag-implement ng dapat social distancing talaga or physical distancing, minimum health standards, i-increase natin yung bed capacity. We must at least have a laboratory at hand. Let's start procuring PPEs if necessary. Para when the time comes, no, na yung LGU na yun ay maging affected ng isang COVID person or maging affected sa COVID, at least confident tayo, ready. Ready yung LGU to really respond to that scenario. So, those are the 8 major activities na kailangan gawin ni local task force if sa isang area under lockdown. So, of course, no, in meeting with the objectives ng application ng ating zoning containment strategy, the local task force or the LGUs are enjoined to closely coordinate and work together. Kasi po, again, no, no government alone can solve this problem. Kailangan tulungan po talaga tayo. Also po, no, the regional IATF with the regional task force are expected, no, you are expected to exercise utmost diligence in assisting and guiding the local government units as they are able to perform all their responsibilities and implement to its the fullest to the fullest po, no, yung zoning containment strategy. So kailangan po talaga tulungan tayo at may coordination. So as flash on the screen, no, ito po yung ating ano to. This is the monitoring and reporting. It may look complicated but actually it's really easy to fill up. Yun sa taas po, that is for the city and municipality. Yun sa baba naman po, that is the for the province level. So just fill out this properly accordingly, no? And it's really easy lang naman po. And ito po, this will also be the guide for the regional IATF in doing the decision on concurrence of the area or LGU to be put in a lockdown. Kasi po, and also po, no, this could also serve as a decision matrix tool for the local task force to decide or to monitor an area na baka may possibility na mag-lockdown kasi dumadami na ang kanyang clustering of cases. Ilang street, block, purok, or subdivision na ba siya ang nagla-lockdown. Ayun. So, in accomplishing this, no, the local task force must designate a focal person for the updating and consolidation of the reporting template and shall submit daily updates to the report of the report to the DILG field officers and respective regional task force. So before we end, no, we would like to express that this endeavor is a commitment for us to strengthen our cohesiveness in managing this challenge we are all confronting. The COVID-19 is creating new ways for all of us to think on how we are able to keep our community, family, and friends safe. So, sabay-sabay po tayo dito sa suyod, no, sa laban ng COVID-19, and of course we encourage everyone to keep your spirits high and capitalize on your resilient self. So yun lang po at magandang hapon po sa inyong lahat. So we are now ready to take in your questions and clarifications po, and Dr. Queenie is with me. Ralph, over.
Okay, thank you very much, Robin. It's a very comprehensive. Questions rounded here. First, Sir Robin, sabi dito, will a circular or advisory be issued for LGU's guidance that non-compliance to the zoning strategy shall be dealt with accordingly, down without following this protocol?
Hello, Ralph. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I hear you. I hear you.
Oo. So, ano po ba yan? We already issued a advisory po for our local chief executive on the implementation of the zoning strategy. And wala pa naman tayong i-issue pa yung mga ganung klaseng provisions because we believe that the local government units are really on top of the situation and are really working very hard to really implement and to safeguard the interests of their community. Po.
Medyo parang mahina ka, Sir Robin.
Yeah. So ayun lang, no. Wala pa tayong na-issue actually na policy or a circular that has sanctions provisions. So however, we really encourage everyone to really work together nga, no, as what I mentioned earlier. Kung sabay-sabay po natin to i-implement ng tama, edi hindi na po tayo aabot sa punto na yun na magkaroon po ng sanctions. Ayun.
Correct. Yeah, tama po yun. It's actually, yeah. Uh, naman. Anyways, there's another question here, somewhat related. If it is the option of the LCE to impose a lockdown in the whole barangay as per NTF 2020-02, even though after assessment niya is dapat purok or block yung dapat ma-lockdown lang. Can the LCE insist in the decision of still locking down the whole barangay? Hirap na matanong, no?
Yeah, si Doc Winnie will answer that, no?
Okay.
Nagsurat kayo.
Presenter ko si Doc Queenie, no?
Tama
Yeah.
po ba yung question is if the LCE will impose a barangay lockdown and then
Yes.
ha
Opo, the LC imposes a barangay lockdown. However, upon assessment is dapat purok or block lang. But still, the LC insists on the
barangay.
barangay lockdown.
Oo. Kailangan kasi sir magkaroon siya ng batayan. So yun yung parameters kanina for a barangay lockdown. So pag na-reach yun, may document showing that the parameter was reached na barangay lockdown dapat ang ila-lockdown. So yun yung may appeal process on that. For example, yung isang purok lang dapat ang ila-lockdown. Tapos ang ginawa ay buong barangay. So ang mangyayari po niyan sir, through a letter, may written letter po kung sino yung concerned individual or group of individuals that will ask for the RIATF or RTF intervention. Nasa grievance ano po natin yun. Kasi minsan, may mga instances po talaga na kahit nga house lang ang dapat ila-lockdown, pero ang ginawa, buong street because of other reason. So once the LCE insist on that, ang pwede po nating gawin, certain individuals or group of individuals can write a letter and then ang susundan natin yung sa grievance, ano natin, gagawa sila ng appeal. Kasi it can be adversity decision, no? May mga cases po talaga na gano'n. So, pag halimbawa nakita ni regional IATF na, "Uy, purok lang dapat 'to, hindi dapat ito, buong barangay." So, an individual or group na affected doon can actually write an appeal. And then if the RIATF, kung halimbawa walang magsusulat, walang brave, walang matapang na magsusulat. So, either the regional IATF na designated officer can also discuss it. Kasi kung may merit yung appeal of downgrading ay imposition, a barangay imposition na dapat purok lang, it can at least may record po tayo noon na ano yung mga parameters na hindi na-reach. So, bakit yun yung naging basehan and determination of which kung existing man or non-existing yung valid na yon, valid na observation, it will be um, the discretion na po nung designated yung officer sa RITF na endorse niya for proper disposition. Kasi nangyayari po yan. Hindi nga lang ano, hindi lang isang purok or isang barangay, pero puwedeng house. Kasi baka mamaya, by all other reason, kaya may mga discrimination din na na-o-observe na isang barangay i-discriminate kaya i-lockdown sila. Pero in its truest sense kaya nga may parameters tayo para sundan yung, tamang proseso.
May addition lang ako route 'no. Ang ano ko diyan, if kasi meron kasi siyang economic na implication if yung buong barangay yun i-insist. Because if you're gonna put the entire barangay into a lockdown, into a critical zone, then you have to provide assistance to all of the constituents sa barangay. Kakayanin ba nila yun for 15 days? I mean, kakayanin pa ba given the state that we're at, no? So, yun.
That's correct. Kaya nga po LGUs are reminded on their zoning na as much as possible yung pinaka granulated unit, yung pinaka smallest geographical unit ang ma-lockdown kasi yung economic activities nga is mahahamper. Although yung sinasabi ni Doc Queenie as well, you could refer also to the NTF memo. It's actually under grievance oversight. That's another remedy po na individuals, they could maybe write an anonymous letter. The RIAT-F, the Regional Interagency Task Force will try to validate if the lockdown was really proper. That's why we are reminding as well our MLGOs and to coordinate with the MHOs as well as with the PESUs para ma-validate talaga if the lockdowns are actually proper. And from there, maybe we'll try to the RIATF will try to get the reason behind on why is it that still the lockdown is in a barangay instead of being a purok. Then maybe we could somehow come up with a compromise if there's a really valid reason. But if there's none, then we have to really go with the proper zoning classification. And tama po nga yun, yung sinabi ni Sir Robin, are you really able to support the community kung talagang nilockdown mo yan? Okay, so I think that answers the question. Now there's another question dito. Even if it's just one floor or one house under critical zone po, the radius method will put 500 meters radius from the critical zone under containment zone or MECQ naman. So parang na-lockdown na rin po ang buong barangay niyan for us considering movement to containment zone is prohibited except for emergency and medical instances only.
Okay, Rob, thank you, no. Jason, thank you for that question. No, we had this, we have the same question from the previous regions that we discussed this. Kahit nasa MECQ tayo, no, the modified enhanced community quarantine, based doon sa omnibus guidelines, meron po kasi siyang mga provisions that allows movement, no? Meron siyang certain criteria sa ating sa mga category 1, 2, 3, 4 that allows operations. No, if you're going to browse through with the MECQ guidelines. Now, iba po si zoning containment kasi if you're going to put an area under a critical zone in an MECQ na community quarantine measures, may stricter na parameters po kasi na activities na kailangan gawin under a critical zone. 'Di ba? Doon example pa lang nito doon sa perimeter control because the perimeter control in the zoning containment strategy is a little bit different doon sa omnibus guidelines under the MECQ. Over.
Okay. Yeah, hopefully that would answer the question from Sir Jason. And there's another question. How many meters in radius is the distance from other classification zones? I think that's what discussed po. If we're using the we'll be using the radius method. That's actually 500 meters if we're dealing with village and down to house. That's if I'm not mistaken, Sir Robin, tama po yun, di ba? Village. And
Yes.
and of course, the border method po is yung from if we're dealing with bigger geographical units.
Yeah. Tama.
Okay, and is it mandatory to give relief goods when a barangay or cluster of poroks is on lockdown? I think that was.
Yeah, sorry Ralph, kung is it mandatory, hindi ko nakuha.
Is it mandatory to give relief goods when a barangay or cluster of poroks is on lockdown?
Yes. Kasi you are limiting the movement eh. You are limiting the movement of the people. So paano sila kakain? Kaya po mas importante if as much as possible no mag-lockdown tayo to the smallest possible geographical unit. Kung maaari. Ayun, yun lang naman.
Okay. Yeah. Further to complement that, if we refer again to the NTF 2020-02, nandun po siya po sa social amelioration and socio-economic mitigation 8.5.1.7. So I suggest you take a look at that. That may sinabi po nga doon. You may use their QRF po to actually provide those necessary assistance to the families if nagkaroon po ng lockdown po. As yun, nakikita nyo na po ba? I hope the participants, especially the LGUs, are looking at the bigger picture at hand kung ano talaga magiging impact ng pag nag-lockdown. Especially pag malaki talaga yung gagawin yung lockdown dyan. Okay, so let's see. I don't see any other questions in our chat box. Anybody wants to raise a question? You could just unmute. Okay. So yun nga po, based on our experience, yung mga nag-request for lockdowns noon, we had difficulty validating it. Kaya yung sabi dito na 24 hours, we cannot beat it because the parameters are not actually correct and according to the request. Kaya yun nga po yung hinihiling namin sa mga field officers to coordinate with our MESUs to come up with the evidence-based yung EBR, let me see, evidence-based surveillance report nila, the contact tracing line list, para masabit agad sa pesos, kasi sa yung DOH car, sa pesos sila nagva-validate. Yes, as much as possible, if you think that there's a possibility that you're going for a lockdown, have this data readily available at hand. Para pag nag-request na po si local task force for a particular zoning classification, then we have the data readily available and come up with the concurrence as soon as possible. Spot maps, they're very important as well. Yung pinakita nga ni Robin kanina sa kanyang presentation is makita mo talaga kung saan yung mga clustering. However, how would we know that it's really a cluster? That yung evidence-based surveillance report and the contact tracing line list would support that particular spot map po. So, tama nga po yung sinabi ni Robin din, talagang coordination lang to. If we we have the proper coordination with the concerned agencies, concerned people, then madali lang po yung magiging concurrence po. Okay? So,
Ralph?
go ahead.
Yeah. I've shared that sa chat box yung link ng PowerPoint, yung may access it po.
Okay, there you go. Yeah, we see it. Thank you very much.
Yeah, however, hindi ko ma-share dito sa chat yung reporting template. So I'll just be sharing it with you na lang, no? I think may copy ka naman nun. Pakibigay na lang sa kanila. Thank you.
Okay. All right. So let's see. Yeah, we'll be sharing the presentations and also the recordings. If you want to hear Doc Queenie's and Robin's voice again, you could do so. We'll be sending the recording of this particular orientation. Sino po? Anybody could unmute and raise their questions while Sir Robin is here. Busy po si Sir Robin. And we are very lucky to have him today to this orientation. May contact tracing ongoing ata, Robin, no? Sa kabila, hinahanap ka. Go ahead, Sir Chris.
Ang ano po, tanong po nun sa amin is, for example, sa interregional po, yung sa boundary kasi ng Abra is Dinarbacan, Ilocos Sur. If, for example, lockdown or naging critical zone yung municipality of Narbacan, yung adjacent municipalities niya dito sa Abra, so are they required to follow the containment strategy na nakaano sa kanila, like for example kung containment zone sila, or it's up to the LGU to adapt depende sa kanilang analysis or sa situation nila?
All right. Thank you, no? So ang point is, yung LGU na magla-lockdown ay ang next na boundary niya ay Region 1 na, because that's Ilocos Sur. Tama ba ako? Am I right?
Sir, yes sir.
All right. So ang gagawin natin ngayon, the regional IATF, actually, no, si regional IATF will communicate that with the regional IATF ng Region 1. Para po actually po that LGU mismo, anong LGU man yun sa CAR, can actually coordinate immediately with the neighboring LGU from Region 1. So may channels tayo on coordination on that. No, we are using the the RIATF channels and the RTF channels as well to help us facilitate that coordination.
Okay, so pero kailangan nilang i-adapt yun sir kung ano yung halimbawa yung mga nasa containment zone, kung ano man yung mga restrictions sa kanilang movements, kailangan nilang adapt. Kung MECQ, dapat MECQ sila.
Yes.
So ganun po ba sir?
Yes po, pwede po nilang i-adapt yon unless may bundok po na pagitan.
So yun nga sir, gaya ng sabi ko, depende pa rin sa assessment ng LGU. Hindi po
Of course.
obligado, hindi po obligado.
It can work two ways, no? Basta depende po sa assessment yan, no?
Okay. Everything okay, Sir Chris? With that?
Yes sir, siguro yun na lang yung coordination ng mga regional IATF, or kung halimbawa naman within the Cordillera, yung paano naman yung coordination din ng mga provinces.
Correct. So we really have to consider all those things. Kaya nga habang lumalaki talaga, nakikita nyo na kung lumalaki yung kailangan mong coordination. So as much as possible, if we are really able to limit it to just a little geographical unit, let's do so. Kasi pag nakikita nyo, habang lumalaki, there's more coordination, more resources needed. But anyways, if it really needs to go as far as that, then LGUs will have to coordinate both ways as well. The regional interagency task forces have to coordinate with each other as well.
Sir Dave,
Isang question?
pwede ako mag-add? Oo, Sir Ralph.
Go ahead, ma'am.
Oo, kasi share ko lang yung experience ng Caraga. Sa Region 13, may 4 provinces and then one province is border siya ng, ang tawag dito, Agusan Norte and Misamis Occidental, Oriental. So yung border po ng province na yon, Region 13 coordinated with Region 10. Kasi yung isang barangay yata, yung magkatabi nun, yung isang municipality ng Region 13 ay may cases, pero katabi lang niya yung municipality ng Region 10. So, yung question po ni Sir Dave kanina na what if yung magkatabi na municipality yung isa ay border siya ng yung sa experience ng Caraga, Agusan Norte. Tapos may mga cases din na ang katabi niyang municipality, wala namang case sa Region 10. So ang ano nun, coordination ang governor kasi ng Agusan Sur, siya yung regional task force chair. So ang naging ano nila, naging coordinative mechanism yung municipality on the Agusan Norte na side, sila yung nag-implement ng critical zone on that area. Tapos coordinated with the municipality na katabi niya and coordinated din siya sa regional task force ng Region 10. So yung kumbaga, tinreat siya as one interlocal health zone kasi hindi naman pwedeng i-cut natin yung response ng pandemic because of political jurisdictions because ang pag-spread ng sakit po hindi niya sinasanto kung saang jurisdiction ka lang. So ibig sabihin, by the nature of this disease na hindi sinasanto ang geographic, ang political, administrative borders, there is really a higher call for collaboration beyond the what's being in the written in our ngayon, 'di ba? Parang management. Although sa interlocal health zone, nawo-work out po 'yan. Yun nga lang, yung challenge ngayon is from one region to the other. So may inter-regional na coordination po na nangyayari. Yun lang, nag-meeting din si Cabsec Nograles doon sa Region 13, sharing the experience para po in case na may mga ganitong instances or circumstance na mangyari sa car, baka pwede natin yun matingnan as one of the practice na pwede nating ma-implement din po. Thank you.